So I'm going to read a little bit more from The Flight of the Romanovs by John Curtis Berry and Konstantin Pleshakov. So I left off here. Guests would arrive and enter the palace by one of a number of great carpeted marble staircases. Huge windows opened onto the river, admitting a flood of light, enhanced by the reflections cast by the sun dancing on the surfaces of the water. Winter froze the Neva into a mass of ice covered with snow. In daytime, a light from out of doors interplayed with the richly veined marble walls of the vast, high-ceilinged reception halls. Cathedral-like spaces with gilded mirrors, inlaid doors, and highly polished parquet floors. An army of liveried servants waxed the floors daily, skating along with a brush attached to one foot. Imperial greenhouses supplied the great halls with orchids and other flowers, sometimes brought by train from the Crimea. The delicate fragrance of orange blossoms sweetened the air. Palm trees lined the main staircase and the corridors. A winter garden roofed with glass provided a place where trees and shrubs could flower through the coldest times, and fountains soothed the ear with their murmuring sounds. One empress even kept a cow in this space so that she might enjoy fresh milk daily. The Winter Palace also had its own theater, seating several hundred people. There, the leading artists of the day, both Russian and foreign, would sing, dance, or act. Sometimes the members of the imperial family would themselves perform in the best tradition of private amateur theatricals, which European royalty so much enjoyed. Using the pen name K.R., he Romanized his name with a K rather than a C. The Grand Duke Konstantin Konstantinovich, an actor and playwright as well as a poet, translated the plays of Shakespeare into Russian for performance theater. In a performance of Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, the young future Nicholas II played the title role, other parts being played by other members of the family. Connected to the palace was a large building called the Hermitage, whose special purpose was to house the collections of paintings, sculpture, and myriad objects d'art amassed by the Romanovs over 3 centuries. Today, the whole building complex is known as the Hermitage, and it houses one of the world's greatest art collections. In the palace at night, illumination was provided by thousands of wax candles placed in wall sconces and crystal chandeliers. An inundation of light into a sea of darkness. Pillars of malachite, porphyry, onyx, jasper punctuated the wall spaces. Huge vases, specially made in imperial factories for imperial use, marble statuary, and finely fashioned chairs, tables, and cabinets were generously scattered throughout, although the vast space left ample room for literally thousands of people to circulate. An imperial reception at the Winter Palace might have been 3,000 guests who ate, drank, and danced. To this glittering setting, the guests would bring their own colorful contribution, the ladies blazing with jewels, dresses cut low to display the bosom and shoulders, the married women wearing sparkling jeweled diadems, the girls wearing flowers in their hair. Military officers wore their richly decorated dress uniforms, often with crested helmets. Court officials wore short breeches, white silk stockings, and much gold braid. The tapping of an ivory-tipped ebony wand by the master of ceremonies signaled the appearance of the emperor and empress. First, the imperial couple would be greeted in the Malachite Hall by the entire imperial family, the diplomatic corps, and the highest court officials, and then perhaps receive presentations in the throne room. At a large event, the imperial party, including perhaps a dozen or more Grand Dukes and Grand Duchesses, would process throughout the enfilade of great rooms, bringing momentary silence to the conversation, deep bows and curtsies as the imperial party made its way slowly through the guests, massed tightly together. The opening dance, a polonaise, was always led by the emperor, but to call it a dance may be somewhat misleading. Its stately tempo was more akin to a parade. Its measured dignity, though, seemed entirely appropriate to the occasion. Our procession, one Grand Duke recalls, had to pass through all the halls with 6 chamberlains in front of us announcing our approach. We circled the palace 3 times, after which the dancing began in every hall, quadrille, waltz, and mazurka being the only dances approved by etiquette. Supper would be served at midnight at small tables, the imperial couple themselves not sitting, but moving from table to table, to chat with the guests and perhaps to take a sip of champagne. Alexander II liked champagne, but drank only moderately because he suffered from asthma. At a reception or a ball, the point was for the emperor to appear to drink and eat with as many guests as possible. A socially accomplished imperial person was not unlike an actor, always in control, fusing dignity with affability, authority, and charm. A few well-chosen words could put anyone at ease, and the trick was to move from one person to another with a remark that might bring both of them into the conversation. A highly trained memory was an immense imperial asset, but everything did not always go smoothly. One guest remembers that at all the great imperial banquets, a court official stood behind the chair of every royal guest to hand the champagne for the toasts. This was a matter of solemn ritual. The wine was first poured out by a footman, then it had to be passed to a page, who in turn passed it to the hander. The hander was usually distinguished, aged, and tremulous, so between them they managed as often as not to upset the contents of the glass all over you. I can still remember my sister's distress when her favorite pale blue velvet court dress turned a vivid green in patches after her handler had spilled 6 glasses of champagne over it. Amid the grandeur and formality of this glittering environment, Alexander II presided over a large extended family whose lives were predictably regimented and formal as well. Nicholas I, Alexander II's father, had sired a family of 4 boys and 3 girls. Had it not been for his fertility and that of the Empress, his dear Mufi, the Romanovs would have become extinct well before the 20th century. In the mid-18th century, at one point there was only 2 Romanovs beside the ruler. All 20th century Romanovs are descendants of the awesome Nicholas I, the Iron Tsar. Of all ruling Romanovs, at least since Peter the Great, Nicholas most epitomized autocracy. Usually tall, with an Olympian profile, and piercing eyes making even brave men tremble. Nicholas seemed more monument than mortal man, loving perhaps, but stern. He treated his children as if they were raw recruits, and he a drill sergeant. Although Nicholas sought to embody Russia, paradoxically his tastes were foreign, and he and his court presented themselves as part of the greater European royal family, a way of enhancing the lordly separation between the Tsar and his subjects. The Romanovs were hardly even Russian in blood. In order to maintain a claim to the imperial succession, the Grand Duke was obliged to marry royalty. Mere nobility would not suffice. If he chose to marry outside royalty, the marriage was considered morganatic. That is, his wife and their children would not enjoy his lofty status. The rest of the family judged morganatic marriage scandalous because the individual who did it obviously chose the gratification of personal desires over the retention of his place in the succession, love over duty, thus shattering his emotional as well as hierarchical relationship to the throne and the rest of the family. As a result, since Peter, most Romanovs had married foreigners. For generations, the various small states of Germany provided Romanov brides, all of them born royal. Each German princeling was proud of his status and would try to emulate, on a large scale as he could afford, the splendors of the environment and routine of Versailles. Pumpernickel courts. Thomas Carlyle, the Victorian essayist, called to them contemptuously. The Protestant German royalty provided brides and grooms also when needed, not simply for Russia, but for all the royal houses of Northern Europe. Baden, Württemberg, Saxony, and Hanover were all possible sources, but tiny Coburg took pride of place. Bismarck dismissed it derisively as the Stadtfarm of Europe. The result was that everyone in Europe who was royal, Romanovs included, was related, at least if they were not Roman Catholics, and the relationships were kept close by continued intermarriage. Northern European royalty comprised one large German extended family. The great poet Alexander Pushkin allegedly liked to illustrate Romanov intermarriage with foreigners with a bottle of water, some red wine, and a few glasses. Setting the glasses in a row, he would fill up the first with wine, proclaiming that glasses are glorious, Peter the Great. It is pure Russian blood in all its vigor. Just look at the crimson glow. In the second glass, he mixed wine and water in equal amounts. In the third, he put 1 part wine and 3 parts water, continuing in this fashion, mixing each new glass with the same inverse progression. As if it were to take this beyond Pushkin's time, by the 7th glass, representing the blood of Alexander III, the German water was barely tinged by the Russian wine, now only 1/64th of its contents. In 1881, at the time of Alexander II's assassination, all of his male Romanov relatives, his 3 brothers and his nephews, his 5 surviving sons from his first non-morganatic marriage, all held the title of Grand Duke, and their wives, sisters, and daughters were all Grand Duchesses. Like an emperor or empress, the Grand Duke or Grand Duchesses were expected to patronize the arts and to support charities, and to live in a grand manner. The presence of a Grand Duke or Grand Duchess at any gathering, no matter how inconsequential, was enough to transform it into an event. The Tsar's charisma extended to the whole family. Although they might walk along the granite quays of Petersburg, even alone or accompanied only by a dog, Grand Dukes were conspicuous. Always subject to popular scrutiny, and the Tsar's secret police kept a careful eye on them. Their role was not easy. If they showed energy and eagerness to serve, that ambition might provoke jealousy and excite suspicion. If, on the other hand, they did too little, they might be judged self-indulgent and hedonistic. Though they were usually mere figureheads of army or navy administration, public opinion nonetheless would judge Grand Dukes harshly for anything that went wrong. Grand Dukes had responsibility without authority. The real purpose of the Grand Duke was to stand by in case he should be called to the throne. Family tradition dictated the pattern for the education of Grand Dukes. As imperial children, they were educated by tutors and could not be sent to schools. Thus, their exalted positions isolated them from other children of their own age. In his first years, a Romanov male spent his time in the hands of women, cared for by a procession of wet nurses and nannies with whom his emotional attachments could become strong, especially as he received little time or attention from his mother. Travel and court duties tended to separate imperial parents, mothers, as well as fathers from their children. From the time of the Emperor Paul in the late 18th century, every Grand Duke was given nominal command of a guards regiment at birth. Real education from a Romanov boy thus began at age 6 or 7, when he would be abruptly and often painfully thrust into an entirely male and military environment. The overwhelming importance of the military arts within Grand Ducal education reflects the centrality of the military to the Romanovs and throughout aristocratic Russian society. The military prized physical fitness and the vigorous outdoor life. Military culture developed its own aesthetic, with brilliant uniforms and sparkling decorations, drills and maneuvers executed with choreographic flourish and mathematical exactitude, all conveying a sense of rationality and order, romance and heroism, but bearing little relationship to the brutal reality of war. But the purpose of this activity was to promote unthinking conformity, not to simulate the conditions of combat. Unlike the chaos of war or even of civil administration, the parade ground offered a mechanical elegance susceptible to tight control. The Romanovs loved it, and even the flinty Nicholas I could weep. At the sheer beauty of a skillfully performed lunge of massed bayonets or a thundering cavalry figure 8. One of the Iron Tsar's grandsons, Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich Sandro, recalls, "To the age of 15, my education resembled the training in a regiment. My brothers Nicholas, Michael, Sergei, George, and myself lived as in barracks. We slept on narrow iron beds, only the thinnest possible mattress being allowed over the wooden planks. I remember that even in later years, after my marriage, I could not become accustomed to the luxury of a large bed with double mattresses and linen sheets, and ordered my old hard bunk to be put next to it. We were called every morning at 6 o'clock. We had to jump out of our beds immediately, for severe punishment swiftly followed an attempt to sleep just 5 minutes more. Kneeling in a row in front of the 3 icons, we said our prayers, then took a cold bath. Our breakfast consisted of tea, bread, and butter. Any other ingredients had been strictly forbidden, lest we should develop a taste for a luxurious life. A lesson in gymnastics and practice with firearms filled another hour, particular attention being paid to the handling of a mountain gun placed in the garden. At the age of 10, I would have been able to take part in the bombardment of a large city. From 8 to 11, and from 2 to 6, we had to study and do our homework. Our educational program, planned for 8 years, consisted
history, French, German, English, calligraphy, and music. On top of that, we were taught the handling of all sorts of firearms, riding, fencing, and bayonet fighting. Tutors punished poor performance. The smallest mistake in spelling of a German word deprived us of dessert. And this was not all. Training continued at the luncheon table when the children were interspersed with the guests and expected to converse with them, laughing at poor jokes and simulating a vivid interest in the political developments abroad entered into our obligations of hospitality and developed in us a sense of self-relying resourcefulness. One was not to talk too much or too loudly, and never across the table. Grand-ducal children rarely saw their parents alone, especially at meals. Even without guests, people were always in attendance. Equerries and ladies-in-waiting who lived in the palace and sat at table. Children lived in their own quarters separate from the adults, and they were not expected to leave that domain unless dressed properly and prepared to behave with decorum. This was then the usual pattern for royal and aristocratic children throughout Europe. Royal children seldom had the opportunity to play with their contemporaries, with the exception of brothers and sisters or cousins, and so although constantly surrounded by people, they often suffered from loneliness. The fact that they were children, not adults, was usually given scant consideration. On coming of age at 16, a Grand Duke swore an oath in the presence of the Emperor to obey the laws of succession to the throne and to respect the institutions of the imperial family, although he would usually not gain full control of his wealth and income for another 5 years. The idea was to break him in gradually to this life of extreme privilege. The education of Grand Duchesses was deemed far less important than that of Grand Dukes. They were brought up like royal women elsewhere in Europe, learning to sew, knit, and to embroider on silk and satin, to play the piano and perhaps the harp, to sing, to draw, and paint, to recite, dance, and to take part in amateur theatricals. Learning how to enter and to leave a room was important, and was the ability to make conversation, and in several languages at that. Grand Duchesses were brought up to be attentive to the sick and aged. Organized work for charities would be an important part of their daily lives. Obviously, for anyone with any intellectual interests or abilities, the prescribed routine was inhibiting. To move outside it caused trouble. Being conspicuous aroused envy and provoked criticism. One Grand Duchess declared that an intellectual mediocrity was both a refuge and a protection, and this was true not only in Russia but in princely circles everywhere. The Grand Ducal families and some other Russian aristocrats in the late 1800s developed a taste for things English, what Vladimir Nabokov called the comfortable products of Anglo-Saxon civilization. Paris, soap, and fruitcakes, playing cards, and puzzles.
Striped blazers and collapsible rubber bathtubs were among the snug and mellow things to be acquired in the English shop on Nevsky Prospect. These English tastes were not confined to the Russian aristocracy. The daughters and granddaughters of Queen Victoria carried to their marriages throughout Europe chintz-covered furniture, vases full of fresh flowers, and a passion for opening the windows to fresh air. Their houses looked like Tudor manors or Mayfair mansions, and meals followed the English pattern of hearty breakfast, family luncheons, afternoon tea, and dinner in the evening. So I'll stop there for today. I had to switch to whispering for a second because someone was wandering around the house. So yeah, I didn't want them to hear me. But yes, that was a little bit of the Flight of the No, I keep wanting to say Flight of the Conchords. I'm so sorry. Flight of the Romanovs. By John Curtis Perry and Konstantin Pleshikov. So I hope that helped you fall asleep a little bit. Thank you for watching my videos and liking and subscribing. Yeah, and commenting and everything. Hopefully these videos help you fall asleep.